Whoa.
It's my beatboxing would be all out of sync in your ears. That's got to be confusing.
Well, Adam, if industrial design were equipped with jetpacks, you would be a biologically enhanced army of robotic pandas attacking from space.
Yes, I would. Welcome to Engineer vs. Designer,
The podcast.
for engineers, designers, and people who can turn simple resin into rock-awesome robots. My name is Adam, industrial designer of CAD Junkie.com.
And my name is Josh, mechanical engineer of SolidSmack.com. Each week's show comes in 3 evenly sliced halves. This week we're talking the art of engineering and design. We'll start with the Fact Smack, courtesy of SolidSmack.com.
Followed by design process tips, tricks, and Q&A, compliments of CADJunkie.com.
And in the third half, we'll talk with Cris Rose, London-based artist, designer, and purveyor of fantastical mixed media sculptures and art.
Welcome, Chris. So good to have you on the show.
Indeed.
Would you rather A, replace your arms with massive, sweet-looking guns that could shoot glitter and heart-shaped pink confetti, or B, have arms that are actual working laser guns, but you have to wear a tutu every day for the rest of your life? Choose carefully.
Well, I think I certainly have the poise and grace to pull off the tutu. Would I be able to combine that with the confetti cannons now? Is that cool?
Oh, you want both.
Yeah, man.
Fantastic. Okay, Chris, very good answer. Stay put. We'll be hearing more from you as the show goes on. Speaking of completely irrelevant and unrelated objects, Josh Mings of SolidSmack.com crushed the eggs of ignorance with the Louisville Slugger of knowledge. What have you got for us this week?
All right, this week's SolidSmack Fact Smack is brought to you by Fortis 3D Production Systems. From your office to the factory floor, Fortis offers efficient digital manufacturing solutions for your business.
They do.
Rock it at Fortis.com. All right, Adam, look, I've always been interested in designer toys.
Yeah?
Yep, sure have. Okay, so you've got all types of designer toys. You've got resin, vinyl, plush, whole slew of other design toys that use various materials and electronics, right? So where did it all start?
Josh, why don't you tell us? Where did it start?
I'd be happy to. So people have been making custom toys actually for years, right? You've probably torn the heads off your own toys, mixed and matched them around, creating your own beautiful amalgamations of plastic and paint. But in the late 90s, that took a whole new turn.
Instead of a 2D design, Michael Lau of Hong Kong created an original action figure for the cover art on a music group's album.
Yep, and that simple action, it could be argued, started it all. Long list of urban vinyl artists and companies started popping up. You'd probably recognized one of the most prominent brands, Kid Robot. Then resin happened, or rather took its place as a medium among designer toys.
With resins, you can create and cast your own figures and make modifications to the designs and customize them yourself a lot more easily.
There have been many an artist working in resin over the years. Then along came one of the coolest custom-made toy designers in all of history, Cris Rose. Not only does he have some of the most badass branding, he's got some of the most badass freaking robots you've ever seen. So, Chris, good gravy, man. I think we've been trying to have you on the show for like 5 years now. Has the show even been around that long, Adam? I don't know.
It hasn't, but 5 years ago, 4 years before we started this show, I was already thinking about having Cris Rose on a show if I had one.
It seems like 4 years. Chris.
I can't believe it's been that long. I don't know what's happened, really. I guess I've just been busy.
Very busy. If you had to tweet the story of your life and the work you do in 140 characters, what would you tweet?
I'm pretty used to the Twitter. I've done about 30,000 tweets, but I think I'd probably try and keep it quite simple. I'd just be like, worked hard, enjoyed every moment. That's pretty much it, really.
Okay, so for those who haven't seen your work, how would you describe it? You can use more than 140 characters this time.
Well, I mean, I think they're obviously retro futurist robots, but I like to think they've got a contemporary twist. They're quite quirky. They're kind of everyman robots. They've got experience that allows them to kind of enjoy what it is they do. I'm not really one for the whole kind of one true hero robot. There's no cliched origin story of betrayal and revenge and deception. It's like my robots are just guys like you and me. They've got their own strengths and faults. I'm not kind of really big into like big war robots and stuff. Like I really enjoy things like Iron Man and stuff like that. But like I'm not really kind of a war kind of person. So they're just regular guys, really.
Right on. So your art ranges in size from 3 inches to 8 inches. I don't know if you've done bigger ones than that, but most are not cheap either. Definitely in the collectible category. So who is buying your robots?
Oh, well, I mean, it sounds like you're reasonably familiar with the art toy scene as a whole, but I mean, it's basically a form of lowbrow contemporary art. So it focuses on kind of the humble art toy as a starting point, but it goes in every direction from there onwards. So depending on like how deep you throw yourself into it, it's just like any other kind of art scene as a whole. But as a whole, like, while it may be kind of potentially more expensive, it's not like we're going to go out and just buy 50 of them on a whim. But, the reality is, like, there are prices, everything from, like you say, a 5-inch vinyl figure from Kid Robot made in China to a 5-foot version of a character from Michael Lau that will be in the thousands. But there's every kind of price point in between, really. So apart from the few kind of wealthy art collectors that grab everything I produce, which I'm very grateful for, obviously. Most people that buy my work are just like my robots. They're just you and me. They're regular guys, regular jobs, bills to pay. They've just got a love of playful art, and it's affordable enough that they can afford a few pieces to just kind of brighten up their homes and workspaces and just kind of make life just a little less serious,
Right.
I love that, and I mean, what you're doing, I love, I love that you say it's lowbrow art, but I mean, I think that's selling yourself short. But I mean, that said, there are a lot more artists out there than there are artists making a living at it.
That's definitely the case.
So, how did you realize that you could make money doing it?
Well, I mean, it just started off as a hobby when I started doing it. I just saw other people did it, and I just love objects. I love two-dimensional art paintings and everything, so I just love things you can hold in your hand, and it's what I always wanted to do from ever since I was like a kid. Like, I remember at 14 being like, all I want to do with my life is I just want to make things that people can hold in their hands and enjoy. I didn't care what it was, and that's why I kind of went off to university and did what I did. But there wasn't really any kind of epiphany moment that kind of went, oh, I could make my money from this. It was something I was doing just because I loved it, and it just snowballed, really. So I guess I've just been quite lucky.
Oh, briefly, what did you do in university?
I went to Brunel University and I studied product design, a Bachelor of Science.
Okay.
So I spent as much time doing stress analysis on folded aluminium benches as I did, life drawing and branding and all that kind of stuff. It was a very, very broad course, but it was very demanding, and it was very expected the most of everyone. A lot of people dropped out of it just because it was so hardcore, but then by the end of it, the people who survived were the people who really had thrown themselves into it and had proven that they wanted to do this no matter what.
So Chris, your products, what are the most successful for you, and how have you been promoting your work?
Well, I'd say they're all successful in different ways. Some sell very well, others I'm just very pleased with them, even if I put far more time and work and energy into them that maybe was actually profitable. I'd say the most popular line that I'm probably best known for is a range of 30 or so little robots called Sprugs, which seem to hit the spot for a lot of people. They're a good size, they're quite cute and quirky. They're the kind of thing that you can pick up a few of them and put them together and you don't have to break the bank. Promotion-wise, I mean, a lot of it's kind of word of mouth. It's all grown quite naturally, but I do use social networking in form of Twitter and Flickr for kind of the direct communication. And I take part in a lot of shows and stuff. I don't spend lots and lots of time on promotion. But I do try and do my best to make sure that what time I do spend doing them, I'm talking directly to fans and fellow artists and stuff, because without fellow artists to inspire me and advise me and just show me how things should be done properly, kind of move me forward, and the fans that directly support me, I wouldn't actually be anywhere. So I think it's very important, but I don't spend my time running around, kind of like trying to do the hard sell in everyone's face.
Right on.
Word. Well, I think that's probably that was probably the worst attempt at a segue. I just totally botched that. I'm sorry, guys. let's move on to the next segment.
Not a problem. Adam O'Hearn of CADJunkie.com. The time has come to squeeze the clasp of knowledge around the two-part quick-set resin of ignorance. What have you got for us this week, buddy?
This week's CAD Junkie Q&A is brought to you by Fortis 3D Production Systems. Fortis systems produce accurate, durable prototypes and production-grade parts using high-performance thermoplastics. See it all at Fortis.com. Now today, as you know, we are speaking with Cris Rose, London-based artist, designer, resin rocker, and creator of the coolest retro-style robots you will ever see. Cris, you are using vinyl and resin to cast these things. Talk us through a bit of the process of designing for this medium in particular.
Well, I mean, I'd say I probably have two types of products, really. I have those that are resin cast additions to existing vinyl figures, and then I have those that are entirely originally resin cast. As you need a fair amount of kit to rotocast your own resin, there's a lot of chemicals and kind of hot plastics and stuff involved. Those pieces are generally batch produced in China or Japan, but they both require kind of different designs for manufacture in my experience. I mean, I'd say that altering your design for the medium is probably the most important thing.
So what are some of the advantages and limitations when designing for vinyl over resin casting?
Well, I think I'm probably more qualified to talk about resin because I've spent far more time working in that. But I mean, I understand both of them. Resin's just my primary medium, and at the end of the day, it's more affordable. I mean, the advantages of resin are that you get great surface detail, sharp edges, you get a really fast turnaround time, and like I said, it's just a budget. You know, the low budget molds, the very low barrier entry. Like, even if you come up with something which isn't the best thing you've ever done, maybe you just wanted to do something like just give it a go, something a bit crazy, something a bit different. You can do all that.
Yeah, you're doing it all yourself, right?
Yeah, and you don't end up breaking the bank because, you know, I don't produce a very large number of these figures. You know, a lot of them are only editions of kind of, you know, 5 to 20 or so, because if nothing else, I just get bored painting more than that at the same thing. I want to move on to the next thing. I've got too many ideas to do loads of them. But I mean, the disadvantages of resin are that it's a relatively brittle material, especially on thin sections. You've got to take into consideration the entire life cycle of the product, and that includes the shipping section. Some of the earlier stuff that I made had some excellent designs, but they were just very, very thin sections that would have worked very well in say, resin or ABS, but unfortunately it was just too brittle with too many kind of bubbles and stuff in it to cause points where it could split from. And it's that kind of rigid nature that also means that it doesn't really work very well for articulation either. And because I don't rotocast anything, mainly just because of the time that it takes on additional steps when you're producing these things, it means that they all have to be quite solid as well, which means they get quite heavy.
I see. Okay, so you're saying you don't rotomold things, meaning you don't rotational molding, where you create a mold and you put in material like the resin, and as it cures, you're rotating the mold so that it becomes a hollow form. Yeah. It's empty. Now you're creating solid forms. How do you create the molds for those?
Right. Well, I mean, the molds that I use are actually the simplest molds you can make. They're just one-piece open molds, and I design it specifically for that because I can do things which are very complicated and everything, but it increases your chance of a part failing to mold correctly. It basically increases your chances of losses and things like this, and it also takes more time to put them together than to clean them up afterwards and all the rest of it. So what I use is just poured silicon molds. It's actually silicon designed for special effects use. So it would normally be on actors' faces, but I find it gives a very stretchy mold for very ease of kind of demolding parts that have, you know, kind of overhangs and things like that. But it molds, it's a mold that very strongly holds its dimensional accuracy, even without an external mold box. I actually use the Lego bricks to custom make each enclosure. Yeah, so it's quite low tech, really.
Yeah, so for the listeners who haven't worked with RTV molds before, I mean, essentially it's kind of like the kind of rubber cake molds you get. Where you've created this flexible thing, and you can pour the resin into it, it hardens in there, and then you can pop it right out. And even if there are undercuts or whatever, it doesn't matter because it's a flexible mold, so you can just turn it straight out of there. To
some limitation. There is a serious limit to how much of an undercut you can do, and I really do design with undercuts and that in mind when I produce them.
Right.
So do you do a lot of the work by hand, or is any of it done digitally?
Well, I model all of my resin cast pieces in SolidWorks, And I have them out to a very high tolerance rapid prototyper, but I mean, even at the qualities I have them made, which is literally as high as I can, I think it's 0.001 millimeter. It really is ridiculously high, so 10 times higher than the stuff I initially had it produced on. But even at those qualities, they're still nowhere near mold ready at that point, at least from my opinion, because I like things to be very accurate and very high quality, because if I don't spend the time to make it like that, then it's I wouldn't feel comfortable putting my name on it. So I spend a lot of time.
You're modeling it in SolidWorks and then having it printed.
Pretty much, modeling it and having it printed. But then I spend a lot of time with a scalpel and sandpaper finishing off every prototype up to a glass smooth surface with no sharp edges. I mean, my last prototype was a collaboration with New Zealand artist Podgy Panda, and it took almost 2 weeks of hand sanding, 10 hours a day. So a lot of films during
hours a day.
It's maddening, but you only have to do it once. You just look after your prototypes, and you can make as many molds from that as you like afterwards. So it's really worth putting the effort in to really get that 3D print up to a high quality standard. You can't just print it and mold it. It's just not good enough.
So for those who might want to try this at home, you're printing with SLA, I assume? Is that kind of
it's a couple of different methods actually, but I think it is mainly SLA.
All right, so you get your SLA back, which is pretty high quality already. Do you then prime it before you sand it, or do you
I go straight to it because it's an ABS already. It's got a kind of very rough, fluffy surface, and even at a very high quality print, you've still got lines and everything in there. And because resin is so high quality in terms of picking up the surface detail, far more than resin ever is by 10 or 20 times easily. If you have a line in it that's laid down because of each of the layers that's been put down as it's been printed, that's going to be transferred perfectly and accurately every single time you do it. And the more time you have to spend sanding every single piece that you ever produce from it, which could be 100, 200, 300 pieces, maybe even more from a single prototype, that's every single one you have to sand. And I'd rather just spend 2 weeks sanding the first thing and make sure that it is absolutely perfect so that it doesn't get transferred into every single resin piece that I cast out of it.
Well, so do you find that a lot of people, after seeing your work, want to know how to do it themselves?
I find that a lot of people have been interested in resin since I've started. There weren't as many, at least kind of within my localized kind of area of the scene that were doing it at the time. But I feel a lot of people are approaching it backwards when they come to me. They'll sculpt a 3D figure in a medium of their choice, and then they'll try and work out how to duplicate it. I have this guy, how do I make resin copies? Kind of, can you help me? Things like this. Because I do it the other way around, I design everything for manufacture. If I can't accurately and efficiently mold and cast something, it doesn't get designed. I adjust my vision to what I can actually produce, because there's no point making the most amazing, detailed, crazy-ass robot in the world. It's just a complete and utter total pain in the arse to reproduce, and then you spend so much time and effort and money on actually making it that no one can actually afford to buy it, even in an environment like you say where things are actually worth a lot of money. I mean, pieces could easily go into the £500, £600, £700 marks, when really people are actually looking for a piece like that to spend closer to 100.
So going along with that, is that one of the first things you would recommend to someone who wanted to start doing their own resin toys, or would you recommend something else?
Well, I tell them to just research heavily into the processes that they're going to be using. Start really, really simple, like stupidly simple, like even simpler than they might think. They'll learn from their mistakes. I learned from my mistakes. Like I went and looked and read and did all this researching, but until you actually start doing it, you don't know what you're actually going to get. But if you design something for production in the absence of knowledge of how things are produced, you're actually going to find it very, very hard going. I mean, knowledge is power. Like, that is true, and it's true whether you want to make something or take over a country. So,
excellent. Great, Chris.
Well, there are those of us for whom stupidly simple is as complicated as anything ever gets. I think that I definitely.
Sometimes the simple side is the
best. All right, we'll be right back.
And welcome back. Today we are chatting with Cris Rose, supreme leader of all creatures mechanically inclined to be experimentally adorable and mindfully anamorphic. Welcome once again, Cris Rose.
We've been trying to get Chris on the show for quite a while now.
Yeah, I discovered Chris way back in 2009, wrote a story about him on Solid Smack, engineervsdesigner.com and have been amazed at what he's been creating ever since.
And so now we get a chance to talk directly to Cris and find out more about what inspires him.
Yeah. So first, Cris, we'd like to find out more about you, man, all right? What's your background?
Well, I mean, I live in London. As I said, I went to Brunel University. I got a BSc in product design. But when I left it, I found it was actually pretty hard to get a job. Certainly one that would cover my bills. There's a lot of people who wanted me to basically, work for no money. But unfortunately, there was a lot of graduates and just not enough jobs. Not if I wanted to stay here and do design anyway. Because, while we used to have a fantastic past in engineering and production, unfortunately an awful lot of it has gone overseas, so I didn't really want to do that. And so I found myself just going off and trying a whole bunch of different stuff, trying to be creative in any of the things that I actually took part in. But I mean, what I'm doing now as an artist just kind of happened because I was just being an artist in the spare time.
So what about before that? Did you grow up in London? Did you always have an interest in toys and collectibles and things like that?
Well, I lived not far away from where I do now, only about 25 miles away. But it's I know in America cities can be very quite sprawling, but here, even London, it doesn't take very long, and then it's like you're literally in the countryside. So I grew up pretty much in the countryside, even though I was only 25 miles away from where I am now. And I was kind of a bit out of the way. We weren't quite around the main town. And so I had a lot of time myself to just kind of run around and explore in, just in the woods and the fields and all the areas and stuff. And I used to spend a lot of time reading, but not kind of, storybooks, factual books, science books. I was fascinated by space. I was fascinated by technology in the future and the things that could actually come out of these things. And my favorite toys were Lego, Lego Technic and things like this. And I was just fascinated by everything, how everything works. I'd just be taking everything apart all the time. And so as soon as I actually went into school and everything, I always did my best to learn everything I possibly could, because it always enabled me to understand how everything in the world worked. And that's all I ever wanted to do, was just make things. So the more things I learned, the more chance I have of actually being able to make something cool in the future. Do
you think some of your taste in kind of your retro style comes from your background in the countryside 25 miles from London? or where do you think that comes from?
Well, I'm not quite that deep in the in the wilderness, but I'd say that I always felt like I was in the middle of nowhere, even though really when you grow up and actually look at it, you go, oh, actually I was quite close to everything. So I say that definitely had a big impact, lots of kind of holidays out in the countryside and all that kind of stuff. But I'd say that like the more recent style of kind of retro robots and stuff was directly inspired by the sheer volume of old radios and TVs and spare parts that were left by my great-grandfather after he died. He was a radio and then a TV repairman all his life. Here in London, actually, where I live now, I'm living where he lived. And he kept a huge amount of stock of old things that he was working on, even well after he retired. We had no idea really what to do with a lot of them. A lot of it we still have, especially, all the stuff that was intact. But I started using some of the more random parts in artworks because it just seemed like a good thing to do with it, rather than just chucking it on a junk heap and, like nothing become of it. The age and the style of a lot of these pieces themselves were from the kind of the 50s and 60s and everything. They actually helped me see the robots in the parts, and it just kind of developed from there. My first real robot character was actually based on my grandfather. As for the nature side of it, well, I've always just had a great love of it. And I always just wondered why everyone always paints robots as being the destruction of mankind and the complete opposite of nature. And I like to think that they could actually live in harmony.
And there is so much to these little creatures, and they all have a backstory. If you look at your store on Big Cartel, it's so interesting. There's so much I want to ask here, but which comes first here, the backstory or the robot design?
Well, I would say for me, it's definitely all about the backstory. I'm just thinking about robots all the time, the world they exist in, how they would work. I'll be in the shower and I'm just thinking, how would a robot, unhindered by human form, best do the job of a postman? And then it all just kind of develops from there.
I love it.
I mean, so is that how most of your pieces start out? You're in your relaxed place, whether it's the shower or whatever, and you just kind of have a daydream, and it goes from there. Or do you have a more intentional way of making this happen? Or
well, I mean, when I'm actually kind of sitting down, and I'll actually, kind of keep in mind what I've already produced and where I'm going and the overall kind of world that I'm trying to produce. But I mean, when I actually sit down, I'm like, right, okay, I've got to properly turn this into a real thing. I'll start off by keeping in mind the style elements. I'll sketch out kind of maybe how the chap might look, what bits might do what, kind of how he might compare to others that I've already produced. I try and make sure that I don't actively kind of find myself just suddenly making something and I'm like, holy crap, that's R2-D2. I do my best to try and keep away from what people have already produced and still very kind of make sure that it's very recognizable as my work and very stylized. But I mean, once I've decided whether it's going to be a little sprog or whether it's going to be a larger kind of premium robot or, something like that, I pretty much go straight to SolidWorks once I've got that sketched out turnaround, because I find it's very easy for me to visualize in 3D, but I find it very difficult to visualize things in 2 dimensions. It almost seems ridiculous trying to take an object that I visualize in my head as a 3D form and try and just kind of capture shadows of it in 2 dimension on paper. So I find that SolidWorks is actually a very fast way for me to block out the basics of this character and have a very good idea of the general form, but it's still dimensionally accurate.
So are there a lot of iterations that you go through? When do you feel like you've actually completed the design?
Well, I go through a lot of variations and iterations, and a lot of the times I'll go through a whole bunch of them and I'll just dump the whole thing because it just isn't turning out good enough, or it isn't unique enough, or it just doesn't have enough character about it. And sometimes I go back to them, but I mean, I save all versions. So there's maybe, kind of 5, 10 versions for quite a simple guy, maybe kind of 20 or more for a larger, more complex piece.
So I'm just wondering, my wife is an art conservator. She works, in the laboratories back of a museum taking care of old stuff, and whenever I look at work like this, I wonder, about its archival quality and whether or not people like you think about it. Are you ever thinking about how long these will last? Do you make decisions about materials and paints and different things based on whether, how long they'll last, or are you ever aware of that?
Well, I would say that the nature of resin in itself it's about its immediacy. And I think a lot about the actual scene itself is about direct immediacy. I mean, you referred to it earlier as urban vinyl. I haven't heard anyone in the scene refer to it as urban vinyl for about 2 or 3 years now, because it started off kind of very Michael Lau, very kind of street graffiti and all the rest of it, and there's still a lot of that in there. But I'm as far away from street as you can possibly get. And yeah, I work in this because it speaks to me and I have my own take on it. I don't try and make it like how anyone else is doing it. In that sense, it is quite immediate, but I do try and make sure that when I actually choose the materials, I always have very long conversations with those that I'm getting my supplies from. And one of the things that I have made very clear is the archival nature of it. But unfortunately, you've got the same problem with all of these kind of polymers and things like this, is that they are susceptible to an awful lot of things in our environment. And unfortunately, some of them are only going to have a limited life if they're kept in, particularly hostile conditions. If you put them on the windowsill in front of a lot of UV light, well, a lot of the clear resins are going to go yellow over time. I mean, that's just a reality of it. There are pieces in the Tate Modern which have literally disintegrated because they were made of some of the first thermoplastics. And they've actually had to then make reproductions of them because they don't exist anymore. And I think in some ways, especially when you look at the fact that my robots are these very weathered, rusty kind of, characters who maybe get repaired a lot, or maybe they don't last forever and get junked or whatever. Like, I think that the thing with art is that some of it can't be held forever. Some of it is as transitive as we are. And that while I do my best to retain all of the digital versions of everything I produce, and because everything I produce has been produced digitally beforehand, even after all of the physical versions of my robots have perished or been lost or destroyed or damaged or whatever, there will always be the digital versions, and those are the versions that have always that were created directly by me. And I think in the future, especially 50, 100 years in the future, then maybe people will be looking back on this period of time at the art that's being produced now. The digital and the physical are not going to be so separate and so kind of one being worth less than the other. I think the digital version will be worth just as much.
Well, so, I mean, I'm actually really interested in this because you say some of your original inspiration comes from your grandfather who's passed and who left you with these really interesting objects, and those have kind of become these robots for you, which, as we've kind of uncovered here by accident, you know, they're of a temporal nature. They may last for the lifetime of a person, but they're not going to last forever. And I think, isn't that an interesting connection?
I think very few things last forever. I think even if you were to make, a piece out of marble or bronze or whatever, the Earth is longer than humanity. It will go on longer than humanity. There will come a point where everything that was ever made by people doesn't exist anymore. And who knows if it all comes round again, or who knows if something will come along and be able to suddenly bring everything back from the void. But I mean, you have to accept that we all have finite lives, that everything ends and changes, and sometimes you have to have something else to end for something new to be uncovered. So it's just the way that it goes, really. You can't really fight it forever.
Yeah, you've got a lot of great pieces here. And my favorites have been the Rotund and the Rampart for sure. And you've got a lot newer ones. What's been your favorite pieces to work on?
Well, I find that really difficult because it's the kind of thing that people ask me all the time. Who's your favorite? What's your favorite? I find it really difficult because it's not. I don't really feel like any of them are just an individual piece, and this is where it all ends up sounding so ridiculously, typically artistic. Oh, it's my work, it's my life. It's just kind of like they all kind of flow into each other. It's almost as if every one that I make is just another component. It's another part. It's just. It's like what I said about the kind of the immediacy of it. There are times when I can just sit down and I've got such a clear vision of what it is I want to produce. I sit down and I produce something in a day. And I mean in a day to production-ready standards, and I send it off and get it actually produced. There are other pieces I've sat down for months on and I've struggled because it's not been quite right. Does that mean that I enjoy the one that only took me a day to do, or that I think less of it because it didn't take so long? Or do I actually enjoy the one that took me a long period of time because I feel like I've actually achieved something when I really kind of then put that all together? It is kind of difficult because every time you do one, it's like you've made a new baby. You love it as much as you've loved all the others. And then to look back at them and say, which is your favorite child? It's just kind of like, well, I can tell you which of them were little shits, but I don't necessarily think that makes them kind of any more or less lovable, you know?
Yeah.
I find it difficult. I do really enjoy the Rotund. I enjoy the Ruckus, which is a more recent one, but I'm hoping to go back to the very first robot that I ever did with the one that was based on my grandfather and do a more updated version of it. It's just easier for me to produce because the one that I first made, I didn't really understand enough. I thought I'd done a lot of research, but until you start doing it, you just don't know. So I'd like to revisit that, and I think that would be nice for me.
What do you think needs to be done, or do things need to be done? How do we get kids interested in design and engineering and in art and design and engineering? And on top of that, what advice would you have for somebody who is either a kid who's interested in getting into this kind of thing, into making things, or a parent who would like to see their kids making more stuff? What kind of thoughts do you have in that area?
Well, I'm not really sure about other people's kids, but I mean, for me as a kid, like I said, it was the Lego Technic. These were my favorite toys. It was about being able to see how things work and being able to make things yourself, and that makes you realize that actually everything in the world was thought of and made by someone, and that someone could be you if you wanted it to be. I think that just too many people have got into this real consumer mindset and mentality that iPads just magically appear, or that like one person is just this genius that just suddenly does everything, when in fact you have whole teams of people who do so many like tiny little things you wouldn't even think of, but they're all really, really important parts of the whole. Like everyone's fed this story of, kind of watch a Hollywood film, one person saves the whole village, saves the whole day, does everything himself, doesn't need anyone else. When in reality, if everyone was brought up more with a mentality of we all support each other, we're all cogs in the same machine, that doesn't mean that anyone is any more or less important than anyone else, because at the end of the day, you take one cog out and the whole thing fails to work. So I think that if you were to just kind of show people that understanding how things work and the fact that you yourself could actually create some of these things just through play and stuff like this, I'd say just encourage your kid to just take things apart and try and learn with them about how things work. Do you know how your car works? Like maybe you don't understand how the internal combustion engine works. Well, just the other day I saw a model of the internal combustion engine. You might think that's a really dull thing, but you'll be amazed the things just kids find amazingly fascinating, because next time they walk out the house, they can look at a car and they can imagine the pistons going up and down, the spark plugs firing, all the energy flowing around the system and the little computer that controls it all. And their imagination will turn that into a little city, or they'll turn it into a bunch of friendly little components that are all like, hey man, I got some information for you. You need to push that cylinder up now, and I'm going to send you some sparks and stuff. And you never know what kids are going to get out of it until you actually kind of really kind of engage them in how things work, and that it's important to understand how things work. I think you risk bringing up children that just expect everything to just suddenly appear and be put in a plate in front of them and always work. And I think that's probably the most dangerous thing. It's probably more important to make sure we don't make that happen than it is to really kind of encourage people, because I think kids really encourage themselves if they find it amazingly interesting.
Absolutely incredible, Cris. We are out of time, though. Having you on the show has been even better than the time. Adam wrapped himself entirely in yellow caution tape and got free tickets at the movie theater because the woman in the booth pitied him. Thanks so much for being on the show with us, man.
Thanks, guys. If I'd have known, I would have worn my duct tape tutu.
Sadly, that story is actually true. If you would like to send caution tape to EVDHQ, please address that to Adam.
And if you'd like to see the free movie tickets, please address those to Josh. Engineer versus Designer, appreciate your comments. If you'd like to spray multiple layers of paint in our eye holes, head over to EngineerVsDesigner.com and spray away.
And if you'd like to see us mounted inside a glass jar, staring out with a look of utter horror, be sure to like us, +1 us, follow us, or whatever, as social media has been correlated with being trapped with no means of escape.
Yep. This show is edited by Simon Martin. Our theme music is by Ross Hartman.
We'll see you next week. And remember, without designers, engineers would knit together hex bolts for hats.
It's true. And without engineers, designers would knit pink and yellow flower hats with impunity.
A production of EVD.